In a 2018 Axios poll, over 2 million Americans were surveyed, asking them what their thoughts were on the opposing political party. Of the Democrats who were surveyed, 21% thought of Republicans as evil, 44% as spiteful, 54% as ignorant, 61% as bigoted, racist, or sexist, and a reassuring 3% as fair. As for the Republicans, 23% thought of Democrats as evil, 54% as spiteful, 49% as ignorant, 31% as bigoted, racist, or sexist, and 4% as fair. Of the open-ended descriptions provided from Democrats of Republicans, responses included selfish, greedy, corrupt, spineless, fearful, and bad. And for the Republicans' thoughts on Democrats, socialist, angry, hypocritical, uninformed, power-hungry, and violent. The poll concluded that if the majority of Americans are so convinced that the other side is not only wrong, but dumb and evil as well, they're never going to be able to come together to solve real-world problems, and they're more likely to elect leaders who can't do a thing about it either. The majority of Americans get their news about the opposing political party from news sources such as CNN or Fox. But is it possible that the storytellers of these news channels are deliberately creating animosity just to get better revenue? Our democracy tells us to be informed, but in the words of Neil Postman, being informed just means knowing what the people around you are talking about. Since the beginning of time, man has always had a fascination of storytelling, from Neanderthals sitting around campfires to medieval bards in castles telling tales of yore, to the modern storytelling world of the internet. And storytelling has always been characterized by one of two things: fiction or facts that sound like fiction. Now, we don't like nonfiction in the storytelling setting because, let's face it, no one wants to read philosophy around a campfire. You don't read Edmund Burke's reflections on the Revolution in France around the campfire. That's boring. Excitement that immediately hooks us stimulates what Sigmund Freud called the pleasure principle, defined it as the driving force guiding instinct. The pleasure principle is strongly appealed to a medium that has the ability to praise, criticize, argue for, fight against, demand justice for, censor, cancel, or bring to light any issue it wishes. I'm, of course, speaking about the news. News is mainly relayed in 4 ways: television, internet, radio, and the newspaper. The internet subcategory would include things like social media, websites, and apps. However, 57% of Americans get their news from the television, so I'll mainly be talking about that. TV started in 1927, and the first ever news was in the 40s. However, it was only available to mainly the wealthy. By the 50s, just about everyone, rich or poor, had access to a TV in one way or another. Ever since the 50s, the newspaper has been in radical decline, and as of 2021, only 3% of Americans claim to use the newspaper as their primary source of information. In 1980, CNN established itself as the first ever 24/7 news channel, promising never to miss an important moment of the world. As of 2021, the top 3 most watched news channels were Fox, CNN, and MSNBC in that order, all consistently having parent companies making it into the Fortune 500 year after year. Each are worth over $23 billion US. Print newspaper only has sentimental value now, whereas TV news is thriving unlike never before. Though they might seem like night and day, there are surprisingly similar themes from left-leaning networks such as CNN and right-leaning ones such as Fox. The only difference is in the message. Consider, for instance, the riots in Portland, the summer of 2020. On the one hand, you got CNN calling them mostly peaceful protests, and you can light stuff on fire because it's for the sake of justice. And on the other hand, you have Fox News saying there's not even such thing as a peaceful protest, they should all be jailed. But they're both extremes, right? The middle ground is frowned upon because the middle ground isn't exciting. Since they muster enough credibility to be thought of as legitimately nonpartisan, news companies give Americans the delusion that they're watching neutral sources, and thus Americans are attracted through fear, pity, or rage. As media companies continue preying on the minds of Americans, making money hand over fist by dividing our nation apart, their ethos and necessity should be examined. The modern man wants to be informed, so he puts his faith in the news corporations he subscribes to. But should we watch or even care about Fox, CNN, and all of the other popular news channels? While these news channels might seem helpful and harmless, we should avoid watching the news altogether. The news has historically always been a marketplace of gossip and entertainment. Its philosophical purpose is deceptive in nature, and it's spiritually corrupting and damaging to the soul. The goal of news is not to inform man on the present state of the world. It's to make bold statements that arouse his attention to hate half the country for some egregious act. If the news disregards its effect on the human mind, it's impossible to deem the news as worthy for the soul. A large percentage of what media companies use to make their material is what I'll be calling fake news. Now, I know what you're immediately thinking. Fake news, the term was coined into pop culture by Donald Trump. However, unlike Trump, I'm not just talking about the liberal news outlets. Fake news is the deliberate distraction, obstruction, or contradiction from the truth. It's the embodiment of the editor's mantra, if it bleeds, it leads. It's the presentation of the gory, sexy, and outrageous facets of society and labels them as important. Such networks would include Fox, CNN, ABC, NBC, CNN, many others. The best example of fake news is in 1931, Walter Duranty, writer for the New York Times, wrote a series of 13 articles analyzing the Soviet Union under the rule of Stalin. Conditions are bad, but there's no famine, Duranty wrote in a dispatch from Moscow 33. Duranty actually went on to win a Pulitzer Prize for his writings. Here's what actually happened, though. In 1931, Joseph Stalin declared all wealthy Ukrainian villagers, farmers, and businessmen as enemies of the state and ordered them to either be exiled to Siberia or to be shot, whichever was more convenient. Later, the 5 stalks of grain decree asserted that anyone, including a woman or child, caught taking from a collective field could be shot or imprisoned for stealing, quote, socialist property. Of those, 60,000 people were arrested and 2,000 were killed. Stalin later closed the border around the USSR, not allowing anyone to escape. Ukrainians were forced to eat literally anything that was edible, including acorns, cats, and the corpses of other villagers. The event was undiscovered for over 50 years and is now called Holodomor, recognized to be a genocide by almost 20 countries. I wonder how the New York Times feels about that now. Prominent news creates a society that feels the need to be informed on a 24/7 basis. There's an implicit necessity for watching the news for fear of missing something important. The only reason for making news daily is to create an information industry. You see, if important news only happened once a month, there'd be no news industry. The news has to function every minute of every hour of every day for the whole year, and this includes holidays. Holidays are great for the news. But the want to be informed all the time is by default impossible. Say, we live in Virginia. Let's say you watch CNN, all right, for 24 hours straight. You don't sleep a wink. You would consider yourself pretty informed after that, maybe. Maybe you actually learn something that applies directly to you. Maybe you learn about the Virginia governor, and this is highly unlikely, but let's say it happens anyway. The Virginia governor lifts a mask mandate. that applies directly to you. You might think, wow, I'm glad I watched that. Now I'm informed. But are you? Virginia's one of 50 states. Yeah, no one remembers Idaho's a state until there's a potato famine. And let's face it, we like to think we're number one because we're in the US, but there are 195 other countries. So how informed are we when all of our news comes from New York or LA? The news industry's emphasis on essential information is quite ironic. On October 16th, 1988, the New York Times came out with this headline: Iran refuses to open border to Iraqi Kurds. The exact same day, on the exact same hour, the Washington Post came out with this article, headline saying, Iran refuses to open border to Iraqi Kurds. Does anyone else see a problem with that? Which is true. One of two things are true. Either Iran changed its border policy multiple times in the same day and the news simply couldn't keep up with it, or it was all just mere speculation. C-SPAN is a notable exception to CNN, Fox, etc. C-SPAN has an equal amount of Republican, Democrat, and independent viewers, and it takes live camera coverage from political events that happen in real time. Sadly, C-SPAN only has a 5% view count from Americans. Why is that? I suggest because C-SPAN's boring. A lot of what you see is just politicians signing documents and giving boring speeches. It's not that exciting. On the other hand, the big three, CNN, Fox, MSNBC, they always promise to be entertaining. The difference between CNN and Fox and C-SPAN is like the difference between a documentary film and an action thriller. In the documentary, the director knows that his audience wants to know more about a specific area of study, whether that be history, science, philosophy, etc. But if you're a teenager walking into the latest Avengers movie, you don't care about all that. And the director knows you want three things. You want cool visual effects, a not too complicated dialogue because teens can't handle that, and a lot of guns. Does that sound very much different from your average 30-minute segment on Fox News? The media loves clickbait. As companies like Google and Amazon have figured out over the years, the best way to grab the user's attention is to put something flashy in front of his face. Consider these clickbait headlines from Fox News. Florida man arrested after DNA on beer cans link him to gruesome 1996 cold case murder, investigators say. Or this one. Georgia body discovery in forest turns out to be life-size doll, Sheriff's Department says. Here's some from CNN. Alleged robber asks victim out for date. Or this one. Why Biden's son of a bitch moment is nothing like Trump's attacks on reporters. The news holds no punches. They'll go after their own. Here's something from Daily Mail, UK. Under Armour CEO Kevin Plank was allegedly having an affair with MSNBC host Stephanie Ruhle and sought her advice over that of his board while flying her around on a private jet. Now, these might sound funny and entertaining, but they serve as absolutely nothing more than that. George Eliot writes, ingenious philosophers tell you, perhaps, that the great work of the steam engine is to create leisure for mankind. Don't believe them. It only creates a vacuum for eager thought to rush in. Even idleness is eager now. Old Leisure was a quite different personage. He only read one newspaper, had a sense of the headlines, and was free from all that. A sea of sensations, which we call post-time. He was happy in his inability to know the cause of things, preferring the things themselves. Eliot reminisces on a time when news was not so infused with everything in pop culture. However, things have changed. The news now is involved with every facet of society. You can see just how involved the news is with everything in the world by just going to the CNN website and looking at the dashboard. The tabs read on the CNN website as follows: U.S., world, politics, business, COVID, opinion, health, entertainment, style, travel, sports. That's everything. The news can even define political parties to an extent. Consider everything you know about cars, what you eat, or maybe what you don't eat, how you respond to COVID. All of these things have become politicized. Driving a Ford F-150 is a political statement. Being a vegan is a political statement. Wearing a mask, getting a vaccine, those are political statements too, and that should not be. Whatever the generalization is from the news, it's never wholesome. For instance, think about the stories mainstream news tells about Christianity. The news loves talking about stuff like the Jerry Falwell scandals, or church-wide homophobia, or random acts of violence that happen to be from people who are Christians. Notice how they'll never say anything like, Bob devotes life to serving in Kenya as missionary. They're only going to go after depressing stuff. This is because of the news' deliberate focus on worthy and unworthy victims. In 1954, the U.S. tried to help Guatemala, ridding the country of communism. But to the U.S.'s surprise, the majority of the country wanted to keep their government. The U.S. didn't seem to care, though, as anti-communist regimes were installed throughout the country, guerrilla warriors were aimlessly pursued, resulting in 10,000 deaths, and psychological warfare was conducted on those who refused to cooperate. It's no coincidence that Dwight Eisenhower was present at the time. It is a well-known fact that the Republican Party is typically on the side of the armed forces. Eisenhower was no exception. As a matter of fact, he had served himself as a general in World War II. And in 1953, he won the election by a landslide, almost 80%. So the media saw, everyone likes this guy. We're not going to say anything bad about him or what's going on in Guatemala, and they didn't. However, compare that with the Vietnam War. President Richard Nixon is still, to this day, even with Trump around, the least liked president of all time. His approval rating dropped to 24% before his resignation. So, therefore, the media was like, great, no one likes this guy. Let's attack his character and legitimacy as president. Years later, Donald Trump became the second most unliked president next to Nixon. Trump was the subject of 41% of all the news in 2016. That's 3 times the amount of coverage an average president gets. Why? Because Trump's a great entertainer. He's great for the news. Now, I'm not providing an alternative for watching the news. I'm encouraging you to simply not watch it at all. I hope I've demonstrated the viewership of mainstream media to be worthless. However, I would highly recommend C-SPAN for those of you who wish to be more informed on how the U.S. political system works. There's a misconception that watching the news is part of being an American, just like voting or paying taxes. However, consider what Thomas Jefferson, a founding father, had to say about the news. Nothing can now be believed which is seen in a newspaper. Truth itself becomes suspicious by being put into that polluted vehicle. George Washington also hated the news and was slandered by a writer named Valerius who attacked his personal character and legitimacy as president. Finally, some may ask, okay, Drew, but if I'm not watching the news, how do I know how to pray for my neighbors across the world as a Christian? And that's a good question, but it also begs the question, who are my neighbors? Before the press was around, Christians were fine. They didn't need to know what was happening in Ukraine because they knew what was happening where they lived. I don't see why today should be any different. Anyone can be informed of the important events of the world without watching CNN by simply living life. James writes, "Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. This stain could easily apply to things like mainstream news. News corporations like Fox and CNN are made for the gossiper. Nothing substantial, significant, or relevant is ever likely to sprout from news sources of the such. Desiring to be informed, millions of Americans are drawn into the news, yet the cause is pointless, as being informed 24/7 is impossible. With the credibility they muster, Americans get the delusion they're watching neutral sources and thus are drawn into it, and the news can politicize every issue from automobiles to plastic straws. But consider what 2 Timothy reminds Christians. For God gave us a spirit not of fear, but of power and self-control. Despite what the world may say, there is good news, and every bit of it can be found in the gospel accounts. At the end of the day, we as Christians know the good news and should be eager to share it with others rather than moping in our couches watching CNN. Solomon writes in Ecclesiastes, "If you see in a province the oppression of the poor and the violation of justice and righteousness, do not be amazed at the matter. For the high official is watched by a higher, and their higher was over him." As Christians, we have reassurance of God's sovereign plan. Kingdoms fall, kingdoms rise. The grass withers and the flower fades, but the word of the Lord stands forever. That is truly good news. Thank you.